Ivan Timpson, who's going to talk about why and how he's become a hazards campaigner. Thanks, Ivan. Ivan's the most technical of us all, so it won't take long, this.
Thank you for giving me the chance to speak to you tonight at the hazard conference. Being a hazard campaigner, it does mean a lot. I'll just introduce myself first. I work at Chesapeake Print and Packaging in Leicester. I've been there for about 24 years now. I've worked my way through the company from different jobs. I'm a senior Unite Health and Safety rep. Being a health and safety rep for about 7 years and a senior health and safety rep for 5. And I'm also a campaigner for hazards and a supporter of FAC. Why I got involved in hazards and a hazards campaign? To me, the evidence provided by the hazards campaign is totally clear to me. Too many people, too many workers are dying. As you've heard from Louise, how it affects the families. More than 1,300 people die each year in work-related incidents. That's approximately about 4 a day. Now surely, if it's 4 a day, we need to be doing something about it. This government's doing very little about it. They say their revised figure for last year is 175. But 50,000 plus die from work-related illness. About 5,000 from asbestos diseases, I believe, and 20,000 from heart disease caused by stress alone. I got involved in this from attending these sort of conferences and attending the workshops, finding out for myself what is actually going on and what this government are actually doing. And hearing the truth about what they're doing. I don't want my workmates, colleagues, to go through, be injured or suffer a fatality at work. We are, as health and safety reps, a safety line. We are, you know, our job is so important. We can stop incidents happening. But this government have decided that they're going to slash and attack health and safety. But hearing what I could do to stop them, and that's why I'm here today, to try and refresh you, or whatever you want to call it, to actually get into being a bit more proactive. You probably are, and you probably do a wonderful job. But I think with what the condemned government are doing, we need to up to them and say no more. We need to take it further. And we need to join the We Didn't Vote to Die at Work campaign. Don't forget it's now gone to the Stop It, You're Killing Us. We need to join these campaigns. Workers' protection, as you know, has been removed. The proactive inspections of HSE, 11,000 of them no longer take place. And I believe it's 56,000 of the local authority ones. Because the government now have decided, oh, it's low risk. Printing, dock workers, it's all low risk. No, it's not. There's chemicals in the places I work for. Things have got better, but they're going to get a hell of a lot worse if we don't stand up for it and fight for it. They're attacking your and my workplace health and safety. It's everyone's right to go to work and come home safe. not end up dead because an employer didn't take our safety seriously. We've got to keep reminding our health and businesses to look. You've got to keep pushing it. You need to put it. I know they want to put profit there. They want to put their business first, but we need to keep stating the facts and keep proving to them by the hazards material. It's time to say no more, defend, and take it further. Well, we've got to keep ourselves well informed. It's part of our duty as a health and safety rep to keep ourselves well informed. One of the best ways of doing that, I found, is checking hazards and hazards campaign regularly. Not just once a year or this conference where it is great to know what's going on. But these websites are kept up to date. We need to keep sort of seeing what's going on, challenging things, so that we're ready to work within our own unions. We can take it within our own unions. Get involved in your local union. I was not, I was a little shy, shall we say, the first time I was asked to go and talk about health and safety at an area activist committee. We now have that every time that we meet. We have a 10-15 minute section on health and safety, what's grailing the government and what's going on, and what we want to do as an area activist committee within the union. Let's get it on our health and safety meetings that we're there. Get it on the health and safety agenda of our unions. It doesn't get far enough up as far as I'm concerned. It keeps sliding down. Health and safety, to me, is great. All these cuts are very terrible news, losing your jobs, etc. All the cuts that they're making. But losing your life is a major thing. And that goes, to me, above the cuts. That's where I stand, and I try and say, look, it's awful all these cuts being made. I sympathise with people, but we've got to, make sure that we put health and safety where it belongs. Talk to on your union course if you can. I emailed my regional officer and said, we don't vote for dark work campaign. Can I have at least 5 minutes on a course, on the health and safety course, just to run through it? They were more than willing for me to go and talk on some of the regional courses. Just for 5 or 10 minutes, just to talk about fact, hazards, and what it all means, and what the government are doing. It's good to use events and days to promote the health and safety, give them the true figures. Works Memorial Day is a great time to do that. You can see a picture of me there in a lovely t-shirt that I'm wearing now. It was a lovely, cold, awful day. As one of my colleagues would say, everybody else was there in their woolies, and there was me in my t-shirt. Alright. But it was well worth it, because we doubled the actual number of people that were there for the Workers' Memorial Day. After speaking to the union and saying, look, can we get something organised? Can we get something done? With the support of my local office, they said, yes, what do you want to do? In conjunction with the Trade Union Association there, we got together and we doubled the number. We're hoping for more things next year, and I'll go on to say one of the things that I got from Twitter later on from this. And don't forget this Union Safety Week as well. I think that's coming up in October that we can use. Within our own unions nationally, we can raise motions right through the proper channels about the current state of health and safety and urge unions to take action. the way we should be moving forward, protecting and enforcing. And submit articles to your health and safety departments about what's going on, what you've done here. Tell them how good the conference is, what you got out of it. It's good to let other people know what's going on, and let's get the news of, you know, what this government is doing out there. Let's get the current state of the dangers facing the workforce. Get involved in marches and demos. As I said, I'm not usually one to get a placard out and start stamping my feet, but when it gets to health and safety and people's health and safety, I want to get out there and do my bit. Keep your ear to the ground to see what's going on. I mean, there's the October 20th one. We could all wear our t-shirts and be there. Make a placard if you like. A4 with this off on here. Inside and outside of work, challenge the health and safety stories gone mad. Given the hazards material that's in the magazines, etc., challenge them, give them the truth. Because a lot of it, they don't know what they're talking about. And challenge the papers to tell the truth instead of, you know, printing utter nonsense. There's nothing to do with health and safety. Make use of our union notice boards, posters. You know, put the centre of the hazard magazine up there. We need like that organised one. Leaflet your local area with the leaflets, you know, with all those things that Hilda said was in your bag. There's 6 things that the lies of the government is telling you. Let people know in your neighbourhood what's going on. What else? Lobby your MP. Now, can I just have a show of hands? Has anybody lobbied their MP about health and safety? Yeah, well, that's great. If we all did it, I'm sure it would start to, you know, be better. You know, we could actually making them to realise, hey, there is something here. Write a letter to the British Safety Council. They're actually asking for safety reps and people to write letters to them. I managed to get in through Twitter. They saw what I was tweeting about and said, do you want to write us a little letter? That's what I have done. You could do the same. Many councillors don't know the truth about what's going on. A Labour councillor challenged me and said, well, if it is that bad, show me. It was easy to do that. And I use social media to talk about health and safety. Talking about the positives of health and safety, because all the bad stories get out there. There are good health and safety stories. Get the truth out there, on Twitter, etc. But one thing I would say is don't talk about your work issues on Twitter or social media. I think you know why. I've had some interesting chats on Twitter, and one resulted in the Labour Rose website asking me to write an article about the current state of health and safety. This Labour councillor didn't know things were this bad, and all through Twitter I managed to talk to this lady, and I've even been asked to go to a Labour council meeting and actually talk on health and safety. In conclusion, we have a great resource in the hazards campaign at our disposal. Let's use it for good effect. Let's not just put it to one side and let it gather dust. Collectively, we can make a difference. Join in the fight to save lives, because that's what we're doing as health and safety reps. Get active, lobby, write, leaflets, etc. And stay in touch through the Hazards Organisation and the Hazard Campaign Facebook site. And, well, thank you very much for listening.
he does have mesothelioma, which is affecting his heart at the moment. And he said, as he normally gets quite stressed when he's giving a talk, don't we all, that he thought it would be better not to do this one today. So he hopes the alternative works, and I am that alternative. I obviously share a lot of Simon's views about cancer prevention, and what I'm going to tell you today is what he's passed on to me, so these are his words, not mine. For those of you who don't know Simon, this is what he looks like, and he set up the Sheffield Occupational Health Advisory Service over 30 years ago, and he's written and published extensively on bladder and other occupational cancers, and he's also an honorary research fellow at the University of Sheffield, but so much more as well. Simon's argument today, and like I said, I share his views on this, is that the HSE cannot be trusted to protect the workforce from occupational cancer, and that you yourselves will play a key role in achieving this. And why is this? Because you've done it before. And I'll just say that again, you've actually done it before. 40 years ago, when Simon first went to Sheffield to work on health and safety, there was no white finger and very little deafness caused by work. It was true that the sound systems in the cinemas in Sheffield had to be turned up louder because people couldn't hear so well, and a lot of the older engineering workers had poor circulation in their fingers. But industrial deafness affected, according to the figures, only a few dozen men, and vibration-induced white finger only a few more. But by the 1980s, people were talking about this epidemic of industrial disease in the older steel, mining and engineering, shipbuilding areas. So what actually had changed? Well, it was all about awareness. In the early 80s, tens of thousands lost their jobs in traditional manufacturing and tried to wring some compensation out of their past employers. Safety reps were trained up, and stewards to carry out hearing tests, and it soon became obvious that the typical hearing tests seen in the case of noise-induced deafness were quite easy to detect. Elsewhere, people took the shortcut to solicitors and sometimes, unfortunately, got ripped off in the process. Even the mining industry, which had disputed the existence of miners' bronchitis and emphysema from the 1950s onwards, were finally forced to set up a bronchitis and emphysema scheme. It's the scale of these changes of awareness which are so important. Diseases which are actually denied or seen as rare throwbacks to the past working conditions suddenly had to be recognised in the hundreds of thousands of cases. In noise-induced deafness, probably going on for 1 million cases. This is why Simon is deeply sceptical of the ability of the HSE or the establishment generally to assess industrial disease in the population. And this is important, as the HSE and the establishment in general. Ironically, in 1974, when the Health and Safety at Work Act came out, the HSE never acquired the clout it would need to enforce on health grounds at the scale required. Its recent response to occupational cancer has been very typical. So if I ask you, how many people here are exposed to carcinogens at work through your jobs? Can you just put up your hands? Okay. Here's a list of carcinogens. You can just have a read through. There are the major groups of carcinogens, things like different metals, pesticides, asbestos, silica, radiation, solar ionizing and non-ionizing, PAHs, which are polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which cover vehicle exhausts, mineral oils, tobacco smoke, and creosotes, solvents and chlorocompounds and chlorinated byproducts, various chemicals, benzene, formaldehyde, nitrazone, and endocrine disruptors, and also shift work, which is long-term night work. Now, I know these tables look very far away from the everyday work you do until you actually look hard at them. And if the byproducts of using chlorinated sterilising agents cause cancer, how widespread is that risk? And what about shift work? There are very large numbers of people potentially affected through shift at work. Now, if I ask again, how many people here are exposed to carcinogens at work? If you'd like to put up your hand. See, that's a lot more. So just a little bit of information, you realise that the potential for exposure is quite high. So I suppose you ask how actually strong is the evidence on this? Well, the people that classify substances and chemicals as carcinogens are the people at IARC, which is the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And the evidence they base their assertions on is the strength and nature of evidence that these substances or chemicals can cause cancer. And there's the group 1, which is the evidence is the strongest. Group 2, where there is strong enough evidence to suggest that these substances probably cause cancer, with strong evidence for cancer in animals, but inadequate evidence in humans. But humans are animals as well, so let's not forget that. Group 2B, where the evidence is more limited for animals and not sufficient for humans. In practice, what happens is these substances enter the sort of arena at group 3 and they're unclassified, and then they become group 2 before becoming group 1 as the evidence against them builds up. And it's exceptional for a substance to actually fall back down the table once it's there. It's a classified carcinogen. So what actually needs to be done? But the question maybe is, what is the HSE actually doing about this? Now, I think the HSE is actually waiting until we all push up daisies. Or maybe they're watching the daisies grow, or maybe they're actually making daisy chains, but they certainly aren't acting on occupational cancer. And it seems exceedingly clear that the HSE cannot be expected to meet these expectations to address this rising instance of occupational cancer. HSE is dithering, it's in denial and delaying on workplace cancer, and it seems extremely clear that they cannot be expected to meet these expectations when we need to know where the carcinogens are at work. We need measures in place to replace them with enforcement to make sure that this has been done. And for the currently exposed, we need to know how they are exposed. We need to know how exposed they are and make sure this surveillance is done. Compensation should be available to those who get cancer through work, and we need to be part of a process by which new substances are classified and tracked. And if they enter materials used at work, then they are classified under the REACH legislation, which is the chemicals legislation from the EU. But who's going to do all this? And in practice, we can expect little from the HSE, or actually any of the cancer establishment for that matter. In 2004, the HSE set out its plans for tackling long latency diseases. These are diseases which normally happen with a delay after exposure that cause them. For example, cancer. And in the recent summary of what it's been doing on this, the HSE set the top 10 priorities. They said in terms of solar radiation and radon, which are actually being dealt with conveniently by other departments, they used the word active quite a lot in connection with these, which is quite hard to understand. Well, for me, quite hard to understand because these are naturally occurring phenomena, and there's quite little we can do about them once we've sort of done the sort of basics. And also, again, on tobacco smoke, which has been dealt with again by the Department of Health. When they looked at other issues such as their work on asbestos, this was actually spelled out in detail. The exhaust fumes are comprised of quite a number of elements, including endocrine disrupting chemicals, which are also carcinogens and potential carcinogens. But in the HSE own analysis of the burden, it uses 2 million ever exposed, and it is likely to be much larger with only over 500,000 driving jobs at any time. The HSE's response, which it recognised must improve compliance, is to depend on guidance that it has produced, rather than on the full battery of requirements for employers whose employees are exposed to carcinogens, such as exposure monitoring, health surveillance, measures for elimination, etc. These numbers can seem tiresome, but they're actually very important, not because we can never be sure how many people are going to get cancer through their jobs, but because they say the importance that the HSE gives to work. If 10,000 people exposed to these diesel exhaust fumes was the right level of people exposed, then there will be nobody here today exposed to diesel at work. And Simon doesn't believe this. And think what happens if you include exposure during travel to work. Diesel exhaust fumes have been this 2A group carcinogen since 1988. And maybe it is that the HSE hope that the problem might just go away, but they haven't got them reclassified. There's actually another important reason that the HSE, for this to be considered more high priority, is that the HSE believes in this cost-benefit analysis for setting acceptable levels of exposure. And it uses the guesses it makes on numbers exposed to actually work out how much is worth spending on reaching higher levels of protection. And smaller numbers mean poor protection. The trade union should be complaining loudly about this. So what can you do about it? Well, what Simon did in Sheffield was to interview patients with bladder cancer about their jobs, and he actually found out that 10% had been exposed to dyes at work in crack detection in engineering and steel. And these dyes had not previously been recognised as potential causes of bladder cancer, but the HSE subsequently showed some interest and put out advice to employers on substitution and reducing exposure to dyes at work. So what can we learn from this? That this was previously unrecognised cause of bladder cancer in the engineering industry, and all had previously been put down to mineral oil exposure. Yet we know that some of the rust-proof coatings and solvents also expose engineering workers to the risk of bladder cancer. It looks as if there are universal risks and highly specific risks in the engineering industry, and the latter have been ignored. You need to look to make sure that you really know what's going on in your trade or your industry. What's happened to you? Oh, sorry, it's the screen. What's to be done and what you can do? There's quite a lot of things you can do. Simon has listed some of them here. You can contact workers to build up an inventory of processes used in your industry. And you can use a checklist to make sure that any exposures that may have occurred in the past are actually tracked down. You can use internet forums and social media to share knowledge of what went on in local factories. You can contact local specialists and hospital social workers, Macmillan nurses, patients groups, and actually interview patients about their work exposure. And you can start with the lung cancer patient, because there's a compensation scheme if they were exposed to coke oven fumes. You can also look at nasal cancer, leukemia and bladder cancer. They're all worth investigating. You can also work with trade unions and other personal injury solicitors to investigate causes that are reported to them. And you can use databases to find relevant research, as members in many other unions have done. For example, the surveyors and the PCS. So Simon thinks that we need nothing less than a trade union inquiry into carcinogens at work. And I think we support him in hoping that actually we see that actually happen. Thank you very much.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm just not ready to start now. Thank you, Hope, for your very kind introduction. And can I just say to start, what a privilege it is to speak at the premier Safety and Reps conference in the UK. As we approach the expected peak of mesothelioma in 2015, and hopefully earlier, it's an opportune moment to review the asbestos tragedy and what it has meant and what it still means to workers and other innocent people who are vulnerable to exposure to asbestos. I'd like, if you'll allow me, to look first at a little bit at asbestos, the diseases that are caused by asbestos, and why this tragedy happened. Asbestos is a friable silica rock, and there's no prizes for guessing that that's a picture of it there. And there are three types. There's blue asbestos, called crucidolite. There's brown asbestos, called andesite. And there's white asbestos, called chrysotile. Now, blue asbestos is 500 times more potent than white asbestos, and brown asbestos is 100 times more potent. But all asbestos causes cancer, irrespective of the relative potencies. When asbestos is milled, it forms into an innocent-looking substance like this. But in reality, of course, we know that it causes diseases. And the diseases that asbestos causes, there are 5 of them. There's pleural plaques, which indicate occupational exposure to asbestos, but don't generally cause symptoms and don't attract compensation of benefit. Then there's asbestosis and pleural thickening. They occur in the lung itself. They do cause breathlessness, sometimes serious breathlessness, and certainly in the case of asbestosis, it takes very heavy exposure to cause this. Then there's lung cancer, and lung cancer is deemed to be caused by asbestos if there's heavy exposure, or if someone already has asbestosis. And finally, there's mesothelioma. Mesothelioma is the most serious of the asbestos diseases. It's found in the pleura, the outside of the lung. It's fatal. There is no cure for mesothelioma. An average life expectancy from diagnosis is 12 months. And uniquely, mesothelioma can be caused by brief and transient exposure to asbestos. And uniquely, it can take up to 60 years to show itself after first exposure. What's significant about this for all of us here is that with exposures we may have at work, hopefully not, today and tomorrow, they won't cause asbestosis or pleural thickening or lung cancer, but they could cause mesothelioma. And the reason for that is that our exposure will be much less if they occur than that which occurred in the past. So the danger for all workers today is that they're vulnerable to the worst of all asbestos diseases. In 1968, a register was set up of mesothelioma. And from 1968 to 2009, there were 42,321 deaths. And it's expected that between 2010 and 2050, there will be between 43,000 and 77,000 deaths. And that means by the end of this epidemic, and this tragedy, there will be 100,000 deaths from mesothelioma alone, and that doesn't take into account the other asbestos diseases. The latest annual figure for mesothelioma was 2009, and that was 2,321. We know that 1 in 70 of all British men born in the 1940s will die of mesothelioma, and more than 1 in 10 carpenters born in the 1940s who had over 10 years' work in the industry before the age of 30 will die of asbestos cancer. How could this happen? Well, Alan Dalton wrote a book in 1978 called Asbestos Killer Dust, and he dedicated this book to the many working class people who've been murdered by the asbestos industry, and to those beginning to fight back for the right for a health and safety workplace. And he gave 4 reasons for this tragedy occurring, or the burgeoning tragedy at that time. The first was the asbestos industry who advised the government. The second was the supine government and health and safety regulators who took the advice of the asbestos industry. The third was official trade unions who sanctioned danger money and failed to support rank and file workers. And fourthly, scientists and doctors who are enthralled to the asbestos industry. And there's another one which has come to light in recent years, and that is the more persistent use in the UK of brown asbestos long after other countries had abandoned its use, which gives us the position of having the highest incidence of mesothelioma worldwide in this country. It's interesting to look at some of the struggles, and a nice cameo is the dock workers. In 1965, they were reassured by doctors that Her Majesty's medical inspectors are no risk to their health. Again in 1967, a dock board inquiry said that there was no unacceptable risk. But the workers continued to stop work, and they forced a rethink on those matters. This is a picture. It was given to me by a man who had mesothelioma in 2011. He was 73 years old. He was diagnosed in January and he died in September. He's on the left. This is Westminster Hospital in 1968. They're putting up a huge fan beside the boilers and they're treading on the asbestos. This is 2 years after mesothelioma was prescribed as an industrial disease. This is 3 years after the Newhouse-Thompson report, published in the Times, showed that mesothelioma was a disease that could be caused by small exposure to asbestos and could take 55 years. It beggars belief that this happened then. It continued to happen for decades, and sadly, but not in the same form, it continues today. But what of the victims? What of justice for the victims of mesothelioma? The first ever custodial sentence for breach of asbestos regulations was in 1996. The second was the sentencing of Paul Evans in 1998. Now, if anyone knows of any other custodial sentences, please tell me, because I think that's it. In 1999, the Medley brothers, quite a notorious case, they used school children to strip asbestos. They weren't given a custodial sentence, they were given community orders, working in the community. We would expect at least, if there was no justice in criminal law, we would expect at least that compensation would be fairly given to people who've lost their health and their lives. But this is far from the case. I couldn't possibly go into the litany of cases brought by employers and insurers to reduce their liability for compensation, especially for mesothelioma. It would take too long. You'll probably have heard of the Fairchild case and the Barker case. In the Barker case, the Labour government overturned a law's ruling within 3 months of that ruling. It was quite unprecedented. But let's look at 2012. On the 28th of March, we saw the conclusion of a case called the Trigger case. This was where insurers tried to change the date at which an insurance policy would be triggered to show who was liable. It took 6 years to bring that case to fruition this year. During that time, hundreds of families waited, and many people with mesothelioma died. They dragged those families through the courts, and thankfully that was a successful case. On the 1st of May, the government introduced the Legal Aid Sentencing and Prosecution of Offenders Bill, or rather the Act. It was brought into effect in May. This Act will mean that your members who are injured at work will now have to pay substantial parts of their compensation for a personal injury claim. Now that is quite wrong. It was something that was just unacceptable for people who had such a short time to live. Because with this Act, it means that people will have to look round for the cheapest deal in order not to pay too much compensation. And it was considered unconscionable that people who had months to live could possibly do that. And I would say that the peers in the House of Lords did a wonderful job in sending back their amendment to the Commons twice to force the Commons to backtrack at least to exempt sufferers from mesothelioma from paying legal costs for a temporary period of time. So it was a partial victory. This is the first page of a 4-page leaflet every MP and every member of the House of Lords received. On the 25th of June this year, the government finally responded to a consultation that the Labour government ended in May 2005, just before the election. And that consultation was to bring in a system whereby the insurers would pay from a fund for those workers who couldn't trace their insurers and their employers were no longer trading. This was especially important to people with long-latent diseases because the employers were long since gone and the insurance premiums had been lost, the industry just neglected to save them, and they destroyed them every 6 months. It was our hope that an Employers' Liability Insurance Bureau, which would provide the same protection to workers as drivers get under the Motor Insurance Bureau would have if the insurer couldn't be traced. The picture here is of Ronald Tetlow. He's currently in a nursing home. He doesn't have long to live. But he said to me, and he said to the journalist who interviewed him and took this, "I'll keep alive till I see the end of this and see a result." Sadly, for Ronald, this isn't the result he was looking for, because the government decided not to bring in an Employers' Liability Insurance Bureau. They decided to introduce a tariff fund limited to mesothelioma sufferers, paying about 70% of the compensation they should receive, not backdated before June the 25th. It will take 2 years to bring in, and many people would die before they're compensated. Ronald was diagnosed, obviously, well before the 25th of June and will not be covered by this scheme. So, what about the workplace today? And this, for me, is probably the most important part of my contribution. Much has changed since we saw the picture in Westminster Hospital. We've got a raft of regulations, we have official trade unions committed to health and safety, and the import and use of all types of asbestos has been banned in the UK since 1999. But there are 500,000 tonnes of asbestos in commercial buildings, and there are more in domestic buildings. The problem is that the regulations aren't adhered to, and when we look at the HSE prosecutions, which are just the tip of the iceberg, we can see that construction companies, demolition companies, engineering companies, retail companies, local authorities, schools and even the zoo are prosecuted for breach of these regulations. And when I say the tip of the iceberg, I really mean that is the case. The prospect of the asbestos tragedy continuing is real. The Institute of Employment Studies report showed that maintenance workers tend not to proactively seek information about asbestos, and only 29% believe that they even ask a question about it. Workers consistently overestimated their ability to recognise asbestos. They tended not to question suspect materials. And a further report showed that 42% of workers think asbestos is a thing of the past. 40% think that very few people die from asbestos diseases, and 36% think that taking proper precautions is too expensive and time-consuming. And this dire message was carried over into the HSC's response to the recent consultation document on revising the control of asbestos regulations, when they were bringing in a new category of notifiable non-licensed work. And they said that the education of bringing in this new category is unlikely to happen without a media campaign, and that the present proposal does not include such a campaign, so awareness is likely to remain low. And that's their prediction. And if we think that the best asbestos campaign that has ever been run by the HSC, the Hidden Killer campaign, has been cut, and only through a campaign from the trade unions, from the Hazard campaign, and from the victims groups were they forced to rethink. And in 2011, in November, there was an announcement that it was being reinstated. But that's not strictly the truth, because if you look at Rory O'Neill's emails with the HSE, which are a treasure, you'll find that in fact, what the HSE is saying is that all significant spend on communication activities has to be agreed centrally by the government, and the HSE has submitted an exemption business case for the Hidden Killer campaign. And that was an email on the 3rd of July. It's now August, and there's no sign of that money coming. So I think we were a little ahead of ourselves by saying the campaign was reinstated. Now, this conference knows better than anyone of the consequences of the cuts to the HSE budget and the assault on health and safety regulation. Safety reps are caught in a crossfire of job losses, intensity of work, protecting workers' health. Never before has the role of safety reps been more important, and never more so than in protecting workers from exposure to asbestos. Frankly, you're the front line in that defence, because unless someone's checking that employers are doing the surveys, finding out where it is, and warning maintenance workers that they may come across it, and it's when they come across it, and they're most at risk because they'll do this regularly, they'll put you at risk and they'll put your members at risk. And no one should underestimate the difficulties you face in this, because a lot of you will have remote facilities managers who you can't get a grip of, who do things without you knowing they're happening, and when they happen they're too late. So there's so much lands on your shoulders to prevent this happening. And then the regulations themselves are a nightmare. Trying to determine who's responsible for what, and what notifiable non-licensed work is a nightmare. And I know that my colleague Hilda Palmer can attest to this, because Hilda updated much of the TEC handbook and had to do the same for the asbestos section, and it's certainly not easy. Now, it's hard to believe that that situation could obtain today, but it's even harder to believe that asbestos is still mined and it's still exported internationally. This graph shows in the top line export to developing countries, Asia particularly. The bottom line shows export to the developed countries, and you can see that from the mid-70s it goes down in the bottom line to developed countries to almost nothing. It's been going up in the developing countries, and it's now at 2,000 million tonnes. It's the same in developing countries now as it was at the height of its import and use into the developed countries. Nothing has changed in that respect. But it's even harder to think that Canada is one of those countries that exports asbestos. And it's unbelievable that the Quebec government in July agreed a $58 million loan to reopen the Jeffrey mine so that asbestos could be exported to those countries. There's been a tremendous campaign in Canada, and Kathleen Rudd is such a light, such a testament to campaigns of what can be achieved. Recently, a consortium of 13 epidemiology societies produced a paper which was absolutely devastating in its conclusions. We were asked to find other epidemiologists who would support this paper, and I contacted our own homegrown one, Professor Pito. This is what he replied. In 1955, Richard Dole published the first clear evidence that chrysotile asbestos causes lung cancer, but he accepted the principle that his mentor, Austin Bradford Hill, taught, and that was that if you're going to contribute to the subject, it was very important to separate the presentation of the evidence from the discussion of what should be done on the basis of that evidence. Epidemiologists shouldn't campaign for a ban if they want to influence the Russian, Chinese and Indian governments. They should produce reliable data on the risk from current production use of chrysotile. From what Helen said, and from Simon Pick-Vance's long association with this campaign, they would ridicule the reliance on epidemiology, which allows bodies to mount up in order to do something. We cannot wait for that to happen for the cancers that Helen has talked about, or indeed for asbestos in the other countries. and it's a shame on us that we weren't able to provide that support. But I'll finish on a positive and optimistic note. The history of the asbestos tragedy has been a history of workers' struggles and workers' victories, slow but sure, and it shows that campaigning can work. It does work. It must work in the future, and it's our responsibility to continue that tradition of campaigning to prevent the exposures that condemn people to the sort of loss of health and loss of lives that my colleagues and I in the support group see. This is Kathleen Ruff standing there. She came over from Canada and she spoke at the Action Mesothelioma Day in Manchester. All of the families there are families of people who've had mesothelioma, and there are many mesothelioma sufferers there. Kathleen is a tremendous example to all of us, but here I know we have so many examples of such wonderful campaigners and people who do a basic job of work as safety reps every day in the face of your own members' grumbles, problems for the management and so forth, and you're the front line, and it's a privilege to come from the asbestos support groups. We deal with what happened. You're the only, it won't be me, it won't be my colleagues, it will be you who prevent this happening again. Thank you very, very much.